Eleanor Grayson sat in the worn armchair by the window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the living room. At 70, her hands were still steady, though they bore the faint tremors of a life spent in service to others. The room was a chaotic tapestry of her grandchildren's toys, scattered crayons, and half-finished puzzles shrined to the role she'd been thrust into for over a decade. She wasn't their grandmother by choice today. She was their babysitter, their cook, their everything. The weight of it pressed into her bones, heavier than the years themselves. It hadn't always been this way. Eleanor remembered a time when her days were her own, when she'd sit at her little oak desk and write poetry, her pen dancing across the page as she wove stories of love and loss. She'd dreamed of publishing a collection one day, of seeing her name in print, of leaving something behind that was hers. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. Her daughter, Sarah, had 3 children: Lila, Max, and little Sophie, in a career that demanded every ounce of her energy. Her son-in-law, Tom, was no different, always jetting off to some conference or another. And somehow, without ever being asked, Eleanor had become the linchpin of their chaotic lives. It started innocently enough. A day here, a weekend there. "Mom, can you watch the kids just this once?" Sarah would say, her voice sweet but edged with desperation. Eleanor, ever the dutiful mother, had said yes. But just this once became every day, every school pickup, every sick day, every holiday. Her poetry notebooks gathered dust, her dreams tucked away like old linens in a forgotten drawer. The children were her joy, yes, but they were also her chains. Today, though, something was different. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the journal on the side table, its leather cover cracked but familiar. She'd found it in the attic last night, buried under a box of Christmas decorations. Inside were her old poems, her younger self's hopes scribbled in fading ink. Reading them had stirred something long dormant, a spark of defiance, a whisper of the woman she used to be. She wasn't just Grandma Ellie, the family's default caregiver. She was Eleanor Grayson, a woman with stories to tell, a life to live. The front door burst open, and Sarah rushed in, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I'll be there in an hour," she said, barely glancing at Eleanor. Lila and Max trailed behind, arguing over a toy spaceship. Sophie, the youngest, toddled in last, her cheeks smeared with jelly. Sarah ended her call and turned to Eleanor, her face a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "Mom, thank you so much for today. I know it's a lot, but we're just swamped. Can you take them tomorrow too? And maybe Thursday? Tom's got a big presentation." Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. The request hung in the air, familiar yet suffocating. She looked at Sarah, her daughter, her mirror in so many ways, and saw not malice but obliviousness. Sarah didn't see the cost. She didn't see the dreams deferred, the hours stolen. To her, Eleanor's time was infinite, her role unquestionable. But Eleanor felt the weight of that assumption like a stone in her chest. "I can't," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm. The words felt foreign, almost dangerous, as they left her lips. Sarah froze, her eyes widening as if Eleanor had spoken in another language. "What do you mean? You can't?" Sarah asked, laughing nervously. "Mom, you always watch them. It's what you do." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the armrests. "It's what I've done," she corrected, her voice steady now. "But I'm not doing it anymore. I have my own life. Sarah, I have things I want to do." Sarah's laugh faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Things you want to do? Mom, you're retired. You don't have a job. The kids need you. We need you. The words stung, but they also ignited something in Eleanor. Retired. No job. As if her life had no value beyond what she could give to others. She stood, her knees protesting, but her resolve unwavering. I'm not your babysitter, Sarah. I'm your mother. And I'm done. The room fell silent, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator. Lila and Max stopped bickering, sensing the shift. Sophie, oblivious, chewed on a stuffed bear. Sarah's face hardened, her voice sharp. You can't just say no. Mom, we've built our lives around you helping out. What are we supposed to do? Eleanor met her daughter's gaze, her heart pounding, but her decision made. You'll figure it out, she said, just like I did. That night, Eleanor sat at her desk, the journal open before her. The house was quiet, the children long gone with Sarah, who'd left in a huff, muttering about daycare costs and disrupted schedules. Eleanor's hands trembled as she picked up her pen, not from age, but from the weight of what she'd done. She'd said no. For the first time in years. She'd chosen herself. She began to write, the words spilling out like a long-held breath. They weren't poems. Not yet. But fragments of her truth, her anger, her guilt, her hope. She wrote of the girl she'd been, the woman she'd become, and the dreams she refused to let die. The act felt like rebellion, like reclaiming a piece of her soul. But the silence of the house was deafening. She pictured Sarah's hurt expression, the children's confusion. Had she been too harsh? Too selfish? The questions gnawed at her, but she pushed them aside. This was her stand, her line in the sand. She wasn't just saying no to babysitting. She was saying yes to herself. The next morning, the phone rang. It was Tom, his voice calm but strained. Eleanor, Sarah's a mess. She's trying to find a sitter. But it's not just about that. She feels like you're abandoning us. Can we talk about this? Eleanor's heart sank, but she held firm. Tom, I love you all, but I've given everything for years. I need to be more than just the family's backup plan. There was a long pause. I get it, Tom said finally. But this changes everything. We've relied on you for so long. I know, Eleanor replied. And I'm sorry it's hard. But it's time for me to live my life too. As she hung up, Eleanor felt a mix of relief and dread. She'd shattered their plan, the carefully constructed rhythm of their lives that depended on her availability. But in doing so, she'd begun to rebuild her own. The journal lay open, its pages a promise of what could be. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of possibility. The days that followed were a blur of quiet rebellion and uneasy peace. Eleanor's house, once a revolving door of sippy cups and sticky fingerprints, felt unnaturally still. She missed the children's laughter, the way Sophie's tiny hand would curl around her finger, the way Max's eyes lit up when she read him adventure stories. But she also felt a strange, exhilarating freedom. For the first time in years, her mornings weren't dictated by school drop-offs or nap schedules. They were hers. She spent hours at her desk, the journal becoming her sanctuary. She wrote feverishly, not just poetry but reflections on her life memories of her youth, her marriage to Henry, who'd passed a decade ago, and the slow erosion of her own identity in the name of family. Each word was a step toward reclaiming herself. But the guilt lingered. Sarah hadn't called since their argument, and Tom's texts were polite but distant. The silence from her daughter was louder than any words. One afternoon, Eleanor ventured to the local library. a place she hadn't visited in years. The smell of old books and polished wood stirred something in her, a nostalgia for the days when she'd lose herself in novels and dream of writing her own. She joined a writing group advertised on a bulletin board, a small gathering of retirees and aspiring authors. The facilitator, a kind-eyed woman named Margaret, welcomed her warmly. "What do you write?" Margaret asked. Eleanor hesitated. "Poetry. Mostly. Or at least, I used to." Margaret smiled. "There's no used to in writing. You're a writer if you write. Bring something to share next week." The invitation felt like a lifeline. That night, Eleanor stayed up past midnight, crafting a poem about a woman trapped in a house of expectations. Her voice muffled but not silenced. It was raw, unpolished, but it was hers. When she read it to the group the following week, her voice trembled, but the applause that followed was genuine. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a grandmother or a babysitter, but as Eleanor, the poet. Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling. Eleanor heard through Tom that they'd found a part-time sitter, but the costs were straining their budget. Sarah had cut back her work hours, and the tension in their household was palpable. Eleanor's heart ached, but she reminded herself that this was their responsibility, not hers. Still, the distance between her and Sarah felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. One evening, Lila showed up at Eleanor's door, her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 10, she was all elbows and earnest eyes, a miniature version of Sarah at that age. "Grandma, why don't you watch us anymore?" she asked, her voice small but direct. Eleanor knelt to meet her gaze, her heart twisting. "Oh, sweetheart, it's not because I don't love you. I love you more than anything. But Grandma has things she needs to do for herself too." Lila frowned, processing this. "Like what?" Eleanor hesitated, then led Lila inside and showed her the journal. "I write stories and poems. Things I used to do before I was your grandma. They make me happy." Lila traced the journal's cover with her finger. "Can I read one?" Eleanor's throat tightened. She opened to a short poem about a bird breaking free from a cage. Lila read it slowly, her lips moving silently. When she finished, she looked up, her eyes wide. "That's really pretty. Grandma, are you going to write more?" Eleanor smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "I'm going to try." Lila's visit was a balm, but it didn't erase the tension with Sarah. A week later, Sarah called. Her voice clipped. "Mom, we need to talk. This isn't working. The sitter quit, and I'm drowning. I don't understand why you're doing this." Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Sarah, I'm doing this because I've given up too much of myself. I love the kids, but I can't be your solution forever. You and Tom need to find a way." Sarah's voice broke. "You think it's that easy?" "We're trying, Mom. But you were always there. We counted on you." "I know," Eleanor said softly. "And I'm sorry it's hard. But I need to count on myself now." The call ended with no resolution, just a heavy silence. Eleanor felt the weight of her choice, but she also felt its rightness. She wasn't abandoning her family. She was asking them to see her as more than a role they'd assigned her. She returned to her journal, her pen moving with purpose. The words were no longer just a release. They were a declaration. At the next writing group meeting, Eleanor shared another poem, this one about a woman planting a garden after years of neglect. The group's feedback was encouraging, and Margaret pulled her aside afterward. "You have a gift, Eleanor. Have you thought about submitting your work?" The idea was daunting, but it sparked something in her. She spent the next few days researching literary magazines, her heart racing at the thought of her words reaching beyond her little desk. It was a small step, but it felt monumental, a reclaiming of the dreams she'd buried under years of duty. The weeks turned into months, and Eleanor's life began to take on a new shape. Her mornings were spent writing, her afternoons at the library or with her writing group, and her evenings reading or tending to the small garden she'd started in her backyard. The garden was modest, just a few tomato plants and some lavender, but it was hers, a tangible reminder of her reclaimed time. She felt lighter, as if she'd shed a layer of herself that had grown too heavy. But the rift with Sarah lingered. They exchanged occasional texts, mostly about the children, but their conversations were strained, careful. Eleanor missed her daughter's warmth, the easy laughter they'd once shared. She wondered if saying no had cost her more than she'd realized. Yet, every time she opened her journal or shared a poem with her group, she felt a surge of purpose that reminded her why she'd made her stand. One crisp autumn morning, Eleanor received an email from a small literary magazine. Her poem, the one about the bird breaking free, had been accepted for publication. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. It wasn't a Pulitzer, but it was a Victoria piece of her soul, validated, printed, shared. She wanted to call Sarah, to share the news, but she hesitated. Would Sarah understand? Would she care? Instead, she told Lila, who'd taken to visiting every few weeks, always asking for another poem. Lila's face lit up when Eleanor showed her the email. "Grandma, you're going to be famous," she squealed, throwing her arms around Eleanor's neck. Eleanor laughed, hugging her back. "Not quite, sweetheart, but it feels good." That evening, Eleanor sat down to write a letter to Sarah, not an email, but a real letter, penned in her careful cursive. She poured out her heart, explaining why she'd said no, why she needed to be more than the family's babysitter. She wrote about her poetry, her garden, the woman she was trying to become again. "I love you and the kids," she wrote, "but I need to love myself too. I hope you can understand." She mailed the letter the next day, her hands trembling as she dropped it into the mailbox. It was a risk, a bridge extended across a chasm of misunderstanding. She didn't know if Sarah would cross it, but she had to try. Days later, Sarah showed up at Eleanor's door, unannounced. Her face was tired, her eyes red-rimmed. In her hand was the letter, its edges creased from being read and reread. "I didn't get it, Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't see how much you were giving up. I thought you wanted to do it." Eleanor gestured for her to sit, and they settled at the kitchen table, the journal between them. "I didn't want to help," Eleanor said, but it stopped being a choice. It became an expectation. "I lost myself, Sarah." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you feel like that. I don't know how to do this without you." Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand. "You're stronger than you think. You and Tom will find a way. And I'm still here, just not as your babysitter." They talked for hours, the first real conversation they'd had in months. Sarah admitted how overwhelmed she'd been, how she'd leaned on Eleanor without realizing the toll it took. Eleanor shared her fears, her guilt, her dreams. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. The next week, Sarah invited Eleanor to dinner, not to babysit, but to spend time together. Lila, Max, and Sophie were there, their chatter filling the house with warmth. Eleanor brought her journal, reading a new poem at Lila's insistence. The children listened, wide-eyed, and Sarah watched with a quiet pride Eleanor hadn't seen in years. As Eleanor drove home that night, She felt a peace she hadn't known in a long time. She'd shattered their plan. Yes, but she'd also opened a door to something Newa relationship built on mutual respect, not obligation. Her poetry was no longer a secret kept in a dusty journal. It was a bridge to her family, to herself. Eleanor's life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Like rediscovering a song she'd forgotten the words to. Her mornings were sacred, spent with her journal or typing submissions to magazines. Her garden flourished, the lavender blooming in vibrant purple bursts. The writing group became her community, their feedback sharpening her craft. She wasn't just Eleanor the grandmother anymore. She was Eleanor the poet, Eleanor the gardener, Eleanor the woman who'd said no and meant it. But the transition wasn't without its challenges. Sarah and Tom had found a new sitter, a young woman named Clara who was reliable but expensive. Sarah still called occasionally, asking for advice or venting about the chaos of parenting. Eleanor listened, offered words of encouragement, but held her boundary. She'd watch the kids for an evening here or there, but only on her terms a date night for Sarah and Tom. A special outing with Lila. She was part of their lives, but no longer their default solution. One afternoon, Margaret from the writing group invited Eleanor to a local literary festival. "They're looking for readers," Margaret said. "You should share your work." Eleanor's stomach twisted at the thought. Writing for herself was one thing. Reading to a crowd was another. But the spark of possibility was too strong to ignore. She spent weeks preparing, selecting her best poems and practicing in front of her bathroom mirror. Her voice, once shaky, grew steady with each rehearsal. The festival was held in a small park, with a stage set up under a canopy of oaks. Eleanor's turn came just as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the crowd. Her hands trembled as she stepped to the microphone, but when she began to read, her voice was clear, her words carrying the weight of her journey. She read the poem about the bird, then another about her garden, and finally one she'd written for Saraha, quiet apology and a plea for understanding. The applause was warm, almost overwhelming. Strangers approached her afterward, thanking her for her words, asking about her writing. A young woman, barely out of college, pressed a business card into her hand. "I run a small press," she said. "We'd love to see more of your work." Eleanor floated home, the card tucked in her pocket like a talisman. She'd done it not just written, but shared, connected, created something that mattered. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream bigger, a chapbook, maybe even a full collection. The girl who'd scribbled poems in her youth was still there, and she was finally listening. Sarah called the next day, having heard about the reading from a friend who'd attended. "Mom, I had no idea," she said, her voice soft with awe. "Your poems, they're beautiful. Why didn't you tell me?" Eleanor smiled, her heart full. "I wasn't sure you'd want to hear." "I do," Sarah said. "I want to know you, Mom. Not just as my mom, but as you." The conversation marked a turning point. Sarah began asking about Eleanor's writing, her garden, her plans. They started meeting for coffee, just the two of them, talking about life beyond the kids. Sarah even joined the writing group once, sharing a short story she'd written in college. It was tentative, but it was progressive rebuilding of their bond on new terms. One evening, Lila asked Eleanor to help her write a poem for school. They sat together at the kitchen table, pencil scratching, laughter bubbling up as they played with words. Max and Sophie joined in, doodling illustrations for Lila's poem. It was a moment of joy, untainted by obligation. Eleanor realized she hadn't lost her family. She'd redefined her place in it. As winter approached, Eleanor submitted a portfolio to the small press. The waiting was agonizing, but she filled her days with writing, gardening, and moments with her family. She was no longer the invisible backbone of their lives, but a presence vibrant, flawed, alive. Winter brought a quiet beauty to Eleanor's world. Snow dusted her garden, and she spent her evenings by the fireplace, her journal a constant companion. The small press accepted her portfolio, offering to publish a chapbook of her poems. The news came in a crisp email, and Eleanor read it 3 times to be sure it was real. She called Sarah first, her voice shaking with excitement. Sarah's squeal of pride echoed through the phone, and they made plans to celebrate. The chapbook, titled Breaking the Cage, was small but significant, a collection of 20 poems that traced Eleanor's journey from duty to defiance to discovery. When it arrived in the mail, she held it in her hands, the weight of it grounding her. Her name was on the cover, bold and unapologetic. She was no longer just a grandmother, a mother, a babysitter. She was Eleanor Grayson, poet. Sarah threw a small launch party at her house, inviting the writing group, a few neighbors, and, of course, the children. Lila insisted on reading one of Eleanor's poems aloud, her voice clear and proud. Max and Sophie handed out cupcakes, their faces smeared with frosting. Sarah watched it all, her eyes shining with something Eleanor hadn't seen in years. Respect. After the party, Sarah pulled Eleanor aside. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she said. "I didn't realize how much you'd given up for us. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Eleanor hugged her daughter tightly. "It's okay," she said. "We're here now." The chapbook sold modestly, mostly to local readers and members of the writing group. But each sale felt like a triumph. Eleanor received letters from strangers who'd read her work, sharing how her poems had touched them. One woman, a retiree like Eleanor, wrote about leaving an unfulfilling job to pursue painting, inspired by Eleanor's courage. The words brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She wasn't just telling her own story. She was helping others find theirs. Spring came, and with it, new opportunities. The literary festival invited Eleanor to read again, this time as a featured poet. She prepared a new set of poems, including one about Lila, Max, and Sophia, love letter to her grandchildren, written not from duty but from joy. The reading was a success, and the small press approached her about a second collection. The dream she'd buried for so long was now her reality. Sarah and Tom adjusted to their new normal. They hired a full-time nanny, and Sarah took on fewer clients, prioritizing time with her family. She and Eleanor grew closer, their relationship no longer defined by what Eleanor could do for her, but by who they were to each other. They laughed more, argued less, and shared moments that felt like gifts. One warm spring evening, Eleanor sat in her garden, the lavender in full bloom. Lila was there, sketching the flowers, while Max and Sophie chased fireflies. Sarah joined them, a glass of wine in hand, and they talked about everything and nothing: poetry, parenting, the future. Eleanor realized she hadn't just reclaimed her life. She'd built a new one, richer and fuller than she'd imagined. As summer unfolded, Eleanor's life felt like a poem in motion, each day a stanza, each moment a carefully chosen word. Her second collection was underway, a tapestry of poems about family, freedom, and the courage to choose oneself. She wrote in the mornings, gardened in the afternoons, and spent evenings with her family or her writing group. The balance wasn't perfect, but it was hers. The children visited often, not as obligations, but as joys. Lila had taken up poetry, her notebook filled with verses she shared with Eleanor. Max asked for stories, and Sophie demanded Grandma's songs. The lullabies Eleanor had sung to them as babies. These moments were no longer shadowed by duty. They were gifts, chosen freely. Sarah and Eleanor's relationship deepened. They took a weekend trip together, just the two of them, to a nearby lake. They talked about Henry, about Sarah's childhood, about the years they'd lost to misunderstanding. Sarah admitted she'd been scared of failing as a mother, of not being enough. Eleanor shared her own fears of being forgotten, of losing herself. The honesty was raw but healing, a bridge stronger than the one they'd burned. At the writing group, Eleanor became a mentor of sorts, encouraging others to share their stories. She organized a reading event at the library, featuring her group's work. The turnout was small but enthusiastic, and Eleanor felt a surge of pride not just for herself, but for the community she'd helped build. Her poems were no longer just hers. They were part of something larger, a chorus of voices finding their way. One evening, as Eleanor sat in her garden, she received a call from the small press. They wanted to nominate Breaking the Cage for a regional literary award. The news was dizzying, a validation she hadn't dared hope for. She called Sarah, who insisted on celebrating with a family dinner. Tom cooked. The kids made a banner, and the evening was filled with laughter and love. As Eleanor looked around the table, she saw her life reflected back, not the life she'd been assigned, but the one she'd chosen. She'd said no to being the family's babysitter, and in doing so, she'd said yes to herself. The plan she'd shattered wasn't just Sarah and Tom's. It was the expectation that her life belonged to others. She'd rebuilt it, piece by piece, into something beautiful. The summer ended with Eleanor reading at a larger festival, her voice steady and strong. She spoke of cages and gardens, of love and defiance, of the courage to say no. The crowd listened, rapt, and when she finished, the applause was thunderous. Lila, Max, and Sophie were there, cheering louder than anyone. Sarah stood beside them, her eyes bright with pride. Eleanor closed her journal that night, her heart full. She'd started this journey to reclaim her voice, but she'd gained so much more: a family that saw her, a community that valued her, a life that was hers. She wasn't just a grandmother or a poet or a gardener. She was Eleanor Grayson, whole and unbroken, her story still unfolding.